We're giving people enough resources to get to where they want to be, and we're helping people who don't have the same opportunities get to the level of those who have automatic privilege.
The desk that I'm sitting at was painted by an LGBT cohort of freshman students. And we set up that cohort within all of our freshman pre-education classes on purpose, because we really want a more diverse population of students going into education, because we know that kids in schools need to see adults in schools that look like them, that experience life like them, that give them a positive pathway into higher ed. So we set up this freshman cohort of LGBT students. We set one up of students of color, and I think we're setting a third one up next year. And then the question was, what would that group of students want to do?
The desks alone, while creating them, I thought were such a cool concept, because it's this very clear visual analogy to the idea that people who are in marginalized groups don't get power, and like the idea of the desk was subverting that commonality that you see every day.
It's in your face, but it's politely in your face. It's I think the first step towards any kind of change is just awareness that these problems do exist. Like the desk with the equity and like your gender's valid and all these things, it's kind of just bringing to light the fact that these are issues that people face that the majority of people aren't aware of. And it's our jobs as people in marginalized communities who are aware of these things to bring that to light.
I had this light bulb moment of, oh my gosh, I'm in the right place at the right time. And I have those moments very, very infrequently in my life, but it was a good moment because I realized, you know, despite all of my hesitation and other issues with coming to this school, there were things, there were events and people and experiences that were going to outweigh whatever doubts I had otherwise. I felt like I was in a place where I realized that at this place where we could discuss inequality, equity, and issues really, really relevant and applicable on a regular basis, then I was going to be set.
This class put that into perspective about how much harder it could be for me if I wasn't even, able to be in the class, and have how much harder even, just that specific class would have been if we weren't in a group of, 16 students and having a personalized education just for our group, which was a wonderful thing. And just that even in that situation, even in me in a 400, 500 person class, there are students that have had, not only have they been like passively ignored, but also actively ignored and actively put down so that they don't feel like they should continue in school. And I just think that's a terrible thing. It should not happen.
I went to the school board meeting with Julie as a representative from the university to show my support for the LGBTQ community, specifically trans students in public high schools and middle schools. Not many people in the LGBTQ community make it through high school just graduating. And especially trans students, they face another difficulty that they have to climb over. And I can't imagine that.
This entire project really opened a lot of doors for me that I don't think I would have been able to have access to without this project and this cohort, and working with everyone that I've had the opportunity to work with. I don't think I would be where I am right now without the support from everyone in this program. And it's just an absolute blessing, to say the least, to be a part of such an amazing environment and to be in this supportive cohort, and all of everything that I've been given is just such a blessing. And I'm crying on camera and it's so silly.
So we're going to just go ahead and get started and let them introduce themselves. I don't know if this is working at all.
So what this is for is we're live streaming this, right? So this is used to live stream, so you're not going to actually hear it over the, it's not like a microphone in that way.
Yeah,
it's a different kind. Yeah. So do you want us to go ahead and start introducing yourself?
Sure. First, let me just say we are going to have very good posture today.
I know.
It's just discovered that we're too short. I won't speak for you, but that's my experience. My legs do not align with the needs of this chair. So sit up like this. I'm CJ Pascoe, and I'm recently an associate sociology last week. Thank you.
That's great.
And it sounds like a lot of you have read my book, Dude, You're a Fag, Masculinity and Sexuality in High School. And I'm excited to answer your questions about it. And in the meantime, I'll tell you 3 projects that have grown out of that very briefly, so you can see where that research has ended up. Right now, I'm working a lot on some conceptual pieces about bullying that I've published in a variety of places. I don't know if you noticed when you read the book that the word bully or a variation of it was used all of 3 times in the book, which is very strange for a book that's ostensibly about LGBT bullying. And so I investigate why that is in these pieces that I'm working on. I'm also attempting to start a new account looking at young people's practices of love, dating, and romance. Which is a lot of what I talk about in Chapter 3, the way in which we translate practices as romance and flirting. And then I'm also right now concluding a study looking at contemporary homophobic epithets, because I get asked a lot, like, how do people even use these terms anymore? And so I took myself onto Twitter. Turns out people do use those terms. And so I'm doing a content analysis of use of no homo in mediated spaces and seeing what that phrase is. So that's what I'm doing. So I'm looking forward to it.
Well, hello everyone. It's great to be here, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. I'm Kevin Kumashiro, Dean of the School of Education at the University of San Francisco. And I think I was here in Eugene 5 years ago. And so it's great to be back. I'm looking forward to meeting many more people doing amazing work. I don't know if my projects are quite as exciting as CJ's, but I would say, part of what's been exciting for me in my role is to try to figure out, I've written a lot about activism and social justice work. And a lot of what I'm trying to do now is to figure out, well, how do we do that work? How do I do that work as a leader of an institution? Because so much of my thinking and my writing has been about being positioned as an outsider, trying to cause trouble and shake things up from the outside. And now I need to think about what does it mean to build an institution where we try to pursue those same kinds of goals. So I would say that's one of my projects. Another thing that I'm doing a lot of writing on now is federal policies. This might sound a little bit boring, but the what used to be called No Child Left Behind, now it's back to its original name, which is Elementary Secondary Education Act. This is the landmark legislation in the federal government around public education, and it's being reauthorized right now. And this is a moment to really shape the most important federal legislation on public education, and to shape the direction that we want the country to go in. So I'm involved in some work there, to try to get educators and scholars to speak up and to say, here's what, we're the ones who know education best, and here's what we think is the direction that we should be moving in. I would say those are 2 things that I'm working on right now.
So we set up today with the class that did all of the projects for UOTeachOUT. So if you're part of that homophobia class, will you raise your hand? So those folks have been working for the last 3 weeks doing a whole variety of projects. They've read both of your books, both of you, and they came up with some of the initial questions for us to ask you. And then for everyone else that's joined us today, there are index cards on your chair and ink pens. So if you have a question, if you'll write it down, then our friend Courtney, she's right back there, sitting in the back, she's going to come by, just hold your card up, and Courtney will come by and get it so that we can read it so everyone can hear it. And so we'll just kind of go back and forth and see what they've asked.
Okay. Yeah. So this is one for Kevin. It says, you acknowledge that the process of queer movement in education is never ending, and you're discomforted by that notion. How do you stay motivated and motivate others to keep this type of education going?
So I'm gonna keep going back and forth because I can't stay back there. So what I appreciate about that question is, you know, I was speaking earlier today about some of the challenges of education in general and social justice education in particular, because I think sometimes we, you know, telling the story of, and hopefully I won't be kind of telling a story that will sound too familiar to many of you in this room. But I was once supervising a student teacher who was in a very challenging 9th grade mixed or untracked English class. And she had this day where she was really struggling with classroom management. And students were just really hard to manage that day. And so afterwards we were debriefing and she said, wow, you know, I can't wait till I'm tenured. And so then I can teach the honors and the AP class because, you know, if they're really well behaved, then I can really teach. And for her, teaching English is something that happened only after students behaved the way that she wanted them to behave, or the way that we think is good behavior. And what that led me to was a series of conversations about what do we think it means to teach. Is it something that happens only after people behave the way we think they're supposed to behave? Or is it only something that's inseparable from classroom management? And there's a parallel to social justice teaching, where many people think, well, can I do social justice, can I do queer, can I do anti-oppressive teaching if I'm in a place that's really oppressive? And I think this begs the question, do we think anti-oppressive education happens only in ideal spaces? Or is anti-oppressive education something that can only happen in spaces that are problematic, that are partial, that are contested, right? In fact, maybe it's kind of an illusion to think that we're ever going to get to an ideal space where there is no oppression. And so this is my long-winded way of kind of getting to this question. Because I think so long as we think that activism is only the easy stuff that happens when everyone's going to be on board with me, well, that's kind of a self-defeating way of thinking about activism. Activism doesn't happen when things go our way. Activism happens precisely when we're working through a context that is pushing us back. Right? Activism, anti-oppressive change happens only when we're working through oppressive contexts. And so it is exhausting, and it is draining, and it seems like it may never end. But I would say we need to remind ourselves that the heart of activism is taking seriously the idea that I'm always addressing the troubled contexts in which I find myself. And if we think about it that way, then in some ways we should find a lot of renewed energy with the idea that queer movement is never going to end.
So how many people in this space are teachers or are becoming teachers? So I'm going to ask CJ, this is a teacher question that they have after having read your book. It's what should teachers be doing to disrupt the rigid gender norms that students have internalized and to counter the belief that it is fine to be a tomboy but unacceptable to be an effeminate male?
Yeah, you know, we ask a lot of teachers, and one of the things I always cringe at when I look back at Dude, which was my dissertation, right? I had no idea what I was doing. And I look back at that and think, I really should have given the teachers more of a voice. I should have asked for their expertise, right? When have they intervened, and when did it go well, and when did it not go well? Because I didn't ask them that. One of the teachers later contacted me, and she didn't know that it had that my paper, that they didn't really understand what I was writing, but that it had gone on to become a book, and she was like, "Is this your book? Is this one you wrote about us? And am I this teacher?" And I was like, "Yeah, that's you, and you're that teacher." And I said, I'm writing a new introduction, and I would love to hear what you have to say about the book, and if you give me permission, I'd love to put your words in the introduction. And she said, okay, I just ordered it, and I'll tell you what I think. And unfortunately, I followed up with her a few times, and I never got to hear what she thought, and I still don't know what she thought. And so I'd encourage teachers to do a couple things. First, to intervene when you hear these things, right? and not to intervene in a way that shames one child for being an awful, horrible homophobe and privileges the other child for being this like victim, right? Because I think one of the things that I hope you took out of Dude, I mean, some people don't get this out of Dude, but one of the things that I hope you took from it is that, you know, these homophobic epithets are fluid, right? And they're a currency for young men and a way in which young men forge emotional bonds with one another. And so are there sort of young men who are unrepentant homophobes and just jerks? Of course. Like, that's who Chad was. Like, Chad was terrifying. I'm still terrified of Chad, right? I don't know where he is or who he is or what he's doing, but I'm scared of him. But he was this outlier. He was not the norm, right? Most of the boys were good guys trying to get through this awful place of high school and trying to forge bonds with one another in one of the few ways they knew how, which was to sort of lob this epithet at one another and then all laugh and know that they weren't this bad thing, and then they could go on and be friends, right? And so I think for teachers to develop a language to intervene is really key. And I think the language that really, I'm not an expert on bystander intervention, but one of the things that I often suggest to teachers is to use those moments as teachable moments and unpack without shaming, right, that language. Gosh, that's so interesting that that's the word you chose to use, or that's the joke you chose to make. That's fascinating. And you know, we see that kind of stuff everywhere, right? You can pull out the scene from 40-Year-Old Virgin, the Know How I Know You're Gay scene. We see this stuff everywhere. It's hysterical. Let's unpack what we actually think we mean when we say stuff to people. Like, that sounds like this, right? And then you can get at a little bit, I mean, these guys are really astute. They know what they're doing, right? And so to let them elaborate on what it is they're trying to do and the identity work that they're trying to do and give them new language to do that identity work. That's one thing. The other is to the extent that teachers are not constrained by mandates around their curriculum to sort of get alternative identities into the curriculum, right? To look at where we might have examples of young men who aren't like dominant bro dudes, right? But might be sort of sensitive artist types, right? Sort of have these other examples of masculinity that you don't really even have to necessarily comment on, but just to have in the classroom, right? That they could be normal, right? Not to do what Miss Mack did, which is to valorize the heterosexual couple and have only that image surrounding you in the classroom, right? I mean, that's so intense when you walk into a class. And that's what you're surrounded by are these normative images of masculinity and femininity. And so I'd really encourage low-key interventions, right? The sort of everyday activism that doesn't make people into good guys and bad guys, but just opens up a conversation.
That's good. Can I follow up a little bit? Because the other piece of that was about the tomboy.
Oh, yes.
And
I ignored the
this
tomboys.
notion of the belief that it is acceptable to be a tomboy but unacceptable to be an effeminate male. Do you think that femininity is not impacted by this? Because
Tom,
a lot about masculinity.
Yeah, I know. You want to talk about the girls, right? I know. I often don't talk about girls. So tomboyism. We know a few things about tomboyism. We know that when girls are growing up, before they're expected to be sort of fully sexual beings, even though we know that starts at a very early age, really up until middle school, you can be a tomboy. It's totally fine. It's cool. There are even ways to do tomboyism in high school. They're still okay, right? As long as you're still normatively attractive, right? Whether or not you identify as gay, right? There is a space for gay tomboys in high school, in some high schools, not all high schools, but in high school, girls have carved out that space, and I think it's partially due to the legacy of second wave feminist activism, where we're like, girl power, girls can do anything boys can do, right? And we didn't do like, boys can do anything girls can do, right? And that was kind of a problem. But the pressures come crashing down somewhere between middle school and high school to be more normatively feminine. So for the girls who can't navigate that really tricky space between normative femininity and tomboyism, those are the ones who are sort of pushed into normative femininity, because we know girls' social status in high school is very much tied to the type of boy she can date or at least attract. Right? And so girls' status in high school is based on their heterosexuality, which really constrains their ability to enact non-normatively feminine or tomboy identities, right? And so I would say the same thing in the classroom, right? We have more images of that, right? Like we've got G.I. Jane, I don't know, that's from like 1980. I'm sure there are more recent ones, I mean, even like roller derby women, right? I mean, that's the sort of alternative mode of femininity, even though there is sex appeal there, there's also this tough roughness there that happens. Does that address?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, this is one that would be great if you want to both address it then. How do teachers grapple with race, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, etc. in the same space and time, and emphasize how they're interwoven with each other?
I just answered the last one. You can go first, but I'm going to just speak for a second.
How do teachers address multiple things at the same time? Yeah. Yeah, I would love to hear that. Let's open up. I think there's a commonsensical thought around this, which I want to challenge. So I think for many people, the commonsensical approach is to say that many of the isms, racism, sexism, classism, heterosexism, are parallel. And so let's address things and let's find the similarities and differences, right? And there's value to seeing the parallelism of the different dimensions of diversity and the different forms of inequity. But what I think is also, what I think we gloss over when that's the only kind of conversation we have are the ways that these are interconnected and inseparable and in many ways reinforce one another. Racism is not devoid, it's not missing elements of sex and gender, right? In fact, many forms of racism are gendered racisms, right? In other words, when we think about the stereotypes of different types of people, there's gender deviation in so many of these stereotypes, right? The stereotype of I'll talk about myself. So the stereotypes of Asian American men are often as kind of nerdy or effeminate or weaker or strange or mysterious. These are gendered stereotypes, right? And that's what I mean when I say that gender and race and sexuality and class and religion are so intertwined, and we miss the complexity when we don't address that. So let's then take this one step further. Not only do we misunderstand the complexity of inequity and diversity, we then, as a result, do not come up with ways of addressing the problems that get at the heart of what's really going on. And so, in other words, sometimes the ways that we think about challenging racism or challenging homophobia end up being very partial and problematic. So what's an example? In the 1970s and 1980s, there was a lot of writing by feminists of color who were making arguments around how we can look at communities of color who are challenging racism and see that patriarchy really, right, sexism really characterizes a lot of those spaces. And similarly, we can look at feminist movements to see that they were very white-centered, they were very Eurocentric, right? I think that's to be expected in the sense that every space is going to be permeated by these inequities. Racism is everywhere, in other words. So just because you enter a safe space for women doesn't mean that racism suddenly disappears. And this is why, if I'm going to challenge gender inequity, I still need to see its intersection with all of these other isms, right? So one thing that I like to say is that activism is always partial and always paradoxical. Right? Activism is in many ways saying who I am and what I'm fighting for. And I cannot do that without at the same time saying who I am not and what I am not fighting for, which means that any activist movement, including safe spaces that I'm trying to create, will in some ways marginalize some of the very members of the community that I'm trying to advocate for, right? And so what this means to me is that whenever we engage in activism, we need to constantly rethink and rework the very initiatives that we're launching. I'm going to create a gay-straight alliance. The solution isn't come up with the most inclusive gay-straight alliance. The solution to me is actually to come up with a way of running a gay-straight alliance where I'm constantly redefining and remaking that alliance so that I'm constantly addressing the ways that it might be pushing out some of the people that I'm supposed to be including, right? There's some of the earliest research on gay-straight alliances, for example, found that it was safe. It was a safe space for some LGBT students, but not for all, right? And arguably, this is going to be the case in any space that you look at. So how do we engage in activism in ways that constantly remakes it? I would argue that this is one of the most helpful ways, I think, of trying to address intersectionality when we recognize that the problems are so interconnected to begin
Thanks for giving me time to breathe. I appreciate that, and giving me a good launching pad. That was good. Great, thank you. So one of the things, sort of an entry point to looking at intersections, I think, is to look at what we're talking about in terms of success, right? So I'm hearing a lot of rumblings these days about the way in which things are better for the gay kids, right? Things are so much better. There's a whole book written about how things are better, right, called The Declining Significance of Homophobia, in a horrible ripoff of The Declining Significance of Race. It doesn't actually acknowledge that it's ripped off from The Declining Significance of Race. And when we hear these phrases like, it gets better, or homophobia is getting better, we have to ask, for whom? Who's it getting better for, right? And when we look at that, right, what the research shows us is that it's getting better for normatively gendered, primarily white kids who are middle class, right? That's who it's getting better for, right? Because they can sort of make up for what sociologists call their stigma, right, their sexual identity, in all these other ways, right, through their class, through their race. And so when we're looking at or making claims about the success of the interventions we've been doing over the past several years, we need to look at who those interventions are benefiting, right? And so to think about this notion, I love this idea that activism is sort of never complete and it's always contradictory, which sort of takes me back to some of the claims made by Patricia Hill Collins or Jasper Poir, who talk about the importance of affinity politics, right? That each group has some sort of aim that they would like to see happen, but that none of those aims are divorced from the aims of other groups seeking social justice. And so what these groups need to do is to practice this sort of affinity politics where they come together, hold each other accountable, and then focus on their goals, right? But in the coming together and holding each other accountable in this sort of fluid way, right, they can sort of keep a check on this result-based sort of analysis that I've raised, like who is this going to be successful for and who is this going to benefit? And I'm really glad you raised gay-straight alliances because there's some really interesting work coming out about gay-straight alliances. 2 dissertations and another article is just published on GSAs and the role of allies in GSAs. And one of the interesting things that threads through these dissertations and this particular piece on allies is that allieness is a way of sort of doing privilege, right? But it's a way of sort of privileging yourself, usually white privilege, right? Saying, I am a good person. I do not embody racism. I do not embody homophobia, and I can't possibly embody those things or be criticized for embodying those things because I am an ally. And it's as if this sort of ally label protects them from any critique, right? It absolves them of any responsibility for these things. And so I'd say the sort of next step then is to develop a way of talking about what scholars have called racism without racists, what we might think of as homophobia without homophobes, right? To look at the ways in which these systems of inequality buttress each other, inform each other, co-constitute each other, right? And it doesn't actually matter what you do as an individual, right? You might not embody homophobia, right? Like, gays should be married, totally, right? No, everybody should have an equal chance, no matter what their race is, everybody's equal, right? But these systems of inequality persist and they buttress one another. And so how do we begin to talk about that, right? And one of the ways we can begin to talk about that is the way in which we see certain populations as sort of holding these ideas and other populations as not holding these ideas. For instance, Prop 8 is always one of my favorite examples around this, right? I don't know if you guys remember Prop 8. It was like a time in California when they're like, no, we want the gays to be married. We're going to repeal this right. And when it got repealed, the gay community was like, wow, freaking out, right? Of course, because marriage got repealed. And the discourse was like, oh, it was religious African Americans in Southern California who were responsible for that, right? And so and that discourse didn't come out of nowhere, right? That discourse came out of this idea that, like, middle-class white people, they're not homophobic, right? The people who are homophobic are religious people, they're people of color, and they're uneducated people. That's who would be homophobic, right? Because that's who would be sexist, that's who would be all these aggressive things, because there's no way that could be sort of contained in the middle-class whiteness that we all embody, right? Who voted against I can't remember, for the gays to get married. And so I think that's one of that sort of takes me back to this sort of like, what is success, right? Because when we're advocating for equality, right, across these different lines of inequality, we need to think about who we're advocating for and who we're working with to change their minds. Who are we defining as the problem here? Where does the problem lie? Because often when we're isolating the problem is informed by racist, classist, heterosexist notions in the first place.
Anybody have questions you want to ask Courtney? Do that.
So, and 4, option 4. And I think I'm going to go with option 4 because, again, there's lots of future teachers in the room. And also, I think this has to do with being a parent of 3 elementary beings. It says, how do you gain support? At an elementary level, what can be done to combat oppression? And how do you gain support this if your coworkers don't agree and have been teaching for much longer than you have?
I want to look to my partner to answer that question. She's an actual teacher in this room who does this on a daily basis. I think the thing to do sort of as a teacher is to turn to people who have done this work, right? So, for instance, the Safe Schools Coalition. One of the things that the Safe Schools Coalition in California did years ago was that they paired up sort of goals about equity and inclusion with the state standards. Right, so they looked at all the state standards for every grade level and what should be taught at each grade level, and then they paired up all of these sort of ways in which one could address equity and inclusion in the classroom with state standards, so that the teacher could be like, hey, I'm teaching to the standards, right? Like I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to. And so that's one of the sort of, is it a trick or is it being a good teacher? It depends on how you view these standards. You can kind of see my point of view on that one. So if you could sort of get some of these things into the curriculum, that's one thing. Another thing is coalition building with parents, right? So who are the parents in your classroom that you can work with, right? Who could advocate with you, so that you could have a group of people to work with and sort of make the case that, no, there are students in the classroom, right, who need this sort of thing. You also need to know your state laws, right? State laws and your county laws, right? Or county laws. Your local school board sort of, this is why you need to talk, because the school board regulations, the sorts of things that they put out, they say you can and can't do in a given school district, right? State laws vary widely. And if you can make the case that what you're doing, right, falls under state law, that can also go a long way. That said, principals have a lot of power to subvert state law, to do things that are directly in violation of state law, and that's why I would always say, sort of try to coalition build. Right, that's one of the most, and seek out best practices that other people have engaged in adverse circumstances.
Can I add to that? I mean, I love everything that's said.
Please add to it.
I'll just add a couple more things. I think one is that, just going with the very first suggestion of talking to other people, one of the reasons I would find that so helpful is because I don't think that there is one way to do this. And what activism or advocacy work looks like in different schools is going to vary tremendously, right? If you're in a school that's very embracing of difference, then your advocacy work is going to look entirely differently than a school that is very, very regulated and restrictive and oppressive. And yet, I would argue, both of them can be very powerful forms of activism, right? It's not the case that someone is doing more. It's the case that someone is doing a different kind of activism because the context calls for different strategies. And the only way that we're going to learn that is by hearing how other people are approaching their work. So that's the first thing I would say is let's not try to find the best practice. Let's try to figure out how can I engage in strategies that are appropriate for the context in which I find myself. And that's going to depend on the leadership. It's going to depend on the community. It's going to depend on your colleagues. It's going to depend on the curriculum, the grade level, the subject matter, all of that, right? I think my second thought is to say that so often when we think about interventions, we think about the big things that require a lesson plan or an event plan. Let's bring in a guest speaker. Let's do a lesson or a unit on this topic, right? And what I would urge us to think about is how changing the ways people think, the way they interact with one another, changing a school requires not only addressing the formal curriculum, but also the much more powerful hidden curriculum that permeates a school. You know, I was talking earlier about how I love to do this workshop where, this activity in workshops for teachers where I ask them to brainstorm what are all the ways that you can observe gender playing out in schools. And what I do is I take those responses and I put them in two separate lists on the board. So as people are throwing out responses, I list them separately. And one of the lists is a very short list, and it includes things like, I'm going to teach a Women's History Month, or I'm going to teach about women in history, or I'm going to teach about women authors, or women in sciences, or gender equity and equal rights amendment, and all of that kind of stuff, right? And then there's this much longer list that includes all the other indirect, unintended, subtle ways, or sometimes not so subtle ways that gender comes up, like how we tease people. We tell a girl that you dress like a boy, or a boy that you act like a girl, you throw a ball like a girl. Or we notice that most of the teachers are women and most of the principals are men. Or we notice that most of the people we read about in history textbooks, or most of the authors we're reading in our English classes are by male authors, right? And the list can go. We notice how we line up people, you know, especially in the younger grades when we line up. Are we still lining people up, boys line and girls line, right? Yes, hopefully not as commonly these days. Or we notice there's so much research, at least from 20 years ago, but I think it still pertains today, to how we compliment people. That we're more likely to compliment boys for, let's say, their performance, whereas we're more likely to compliment girls for their behavior and their appearance, right? So all of these ways are ways in which gender comes up. And what I like to then do is say, well, what's the difference between these two lists? Well, if you think about it, the short lists are the things that we write a lesson plan for. That's the hidden curriculum. And that's often what we focus on when we say, how can we address gender? The much longer list is the hidden curriculum. It's all the unintended ways that gender comes up. And because it's much more everyday, because it's much more subtle, because it's much more pervasive, it's also the much more powerful teacher. So, in other words, I can say over and over again, let's treat boys and girls the same. But if through my actions they're seeing that I don't do that, that I'm actually asking the girls to sweep and the boys to move the tables, or I'm actually hiring certain people for certain jobs and other people for other kinds of jobs, or primarily the people we're reading is only one group, that's the more powerful teacher, right? And so what I like to say is, I think when we think about change, we need to think about, are we addressing all of the elements of the hidden curriculum in education? And that requires much more everyday, subtle work. It's not the big lesson or the big assembly. Those things help. But the much more powerful teacher still remains untouched, the hidden curriculum, right? When we think about interventions, whether we're talking about a 5-year-old class or a 15-year-old class, I think we need to be thinking about the many ways that inequity plays out, and therefore the many ways that we can intervene.
So again, this is one we both could jump into. This comes from someone who's in the field of special education. Do you think school interventions, the inclusive models like PBIS, positive behavior supports, help benefit the perception of schools and teachers? In other words, are these programs on the right track for moving to a more ideal education system?
Oh, I'm going to let you answer that. It's totally out of my realm of knowledge.
Yeah, well, so I'll throw out an answer, and I hope that it addresses the question. So there are so many reforms underway right now, and it's hard to categorize all the reforms. Some reforms I love, and I think that they would be so helpful for a much broader audience, right? One of the landmark legislations from, 4 decades ago is what used to be called that Education for All Handicapped Children, right, which is now IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. And one of the landmark parts of that legislation is the individualized education programs or plans, right? And what a wonderful way to think about how education should not be all about treating everyone as if you're without identities and without differences and without passions and without hearts, but to really tailor education as much as we can to who they are, right? So there are some reforms that I think would benefit education as a whole. However, what I think is problematic right now is that there are so many reforms underway that are taking us in the exact opposite direction that they need to be taking us. Let me give an example. So right now we're in the midst of the turnaround school movement. This is like national policy, right? Because we look at test scores, and if the test scores aren't going up, then that means they must be failing schools, and so then the sanctions begin. And after 1 year, this happens, and after 2 years, this happens, and eventually we turn around the school, we get rid of the leadership, and we bring in different leadership. Okay, where did this take place? Well, this took place in Chicago. So let's talk a little bit about Chicago, which is where I used to live. Under this turnaround school reform plan, what we say should happen when schools are struggling is we should make students take more tests. They're not doing so well on tests, so let's make them take more tests. And let's spend more time preparing for those tests. So we're going to cut out all the extra things like the arts and physical education and things like that in order to focus on basic math and basic reading. And in fact, since we don't trust that teachers are doing a good job, let's take away the ability of teachers to develop their own curriculums, and let's hand them the curriculums. Okay. Chicago is home to one of the top schools in the nation. It's where President Obama used to send his kids. It's where the mayor sends his kids. It's the University of Chicago Lab Schools. And what does that school look like? Well, it has unionized teachers where they're developing their curriculums locally. It's an incredibly interdisciplinary curriculum with all sorts of subjects, including recess, including physical education, including the arts. And they not only spend less time preparing for tests, they actually take less tests. So why do I bring this up? Because I think it's very troubling to see that when a school is struggling, we say that they should do all these things that actually take them in the exact opposite direction of where they should be heading, which is what characterizes the top performing schools. This contradiction can be seen in so many different reforms, right? There's all sorts of reforms around Common Core state standards, around high-stakes testing and assessments, around how we evaluate teachers, around how we evaluate schools. And what I would argue is that so many of these reforms actually take us away from where we should be going. And it's because they're buying into certain stories about what is wrong with schools and what is right. And primarily, that story is that the problem lies with the individual. So we're going to hold people accountable, we're going to measure, we're going to test, and we're going to punish. I bring all this up in the context of IDA because isn't it ironic that in some ways, some of the most powerful reforms that are about tailoring and individualizing also can be taken in a different direction that goes really problematically, like blaming teachers for all that's wrong, and so therefore let's just hold them accountable and punish individual teachers. What we need to be doing with reforms is look at systems, at what's happening with the education system, not just what's happening with individuals and how they perform. And that's what I would say is how we should think about a lot of these reforms that are coming up, but even reforms around LGBTQ equity, right? So long as we only focus on individual behaviors or individual biases, we're missing the much bigger problem of how the public school system is one that is heterosexist and homophobic, right? It's not just individuals that are problems, it's systems that are problems. And if reforms don't tackle the bigger fundamental problem, they're going to be missing the picture.
Are there more questions, or since we all have cards? We hand up to Court. So I'm going to take us back to CJ's writing some dude. And so this is, I think this is sort of a research question, a curiosity. And it's, how did you create a space where you were able to sort of survey and hear the kinds of things you did? So can you just talk a little bit about your process around collecting that data? And
Sure.
It's a familiar question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Process about being an ethnographer. So when I researched Dude, I hung out for about 1.5 years in a public school, and you know, that's the word I use for ethnography. Right? Ethnography is a fancy sociology word, or the anthropology word, for becoming a part of a community of people, right? And lots of times we call it sort of participant observation, and I couldn't really call what I was doing participant observation since I didn't become a high schooler, although lots of the kids were like, oh, it's like never been kissed, you're just like never been kissed. And I'm like, oh guys, no. And I was like, I have been kissed, so we're good. Been there, done that, and that would make me feel better. And I say that in order to sort of show the kind of jokes that I made, that I use as sort of a currency to get in with these kids, right? Going back to high school is terrifying because when you go back to high school, as not as a teacher, you're not in charge of anybody, you're not an administrator, and you're not a kid. And so what in the world are you doing there, right? And so to be in that space without any official role, right, or the only role you ever knew was as a student, which is the only role I had ever been in high school, really sort of puts you back in this place where you're like, am I 16 again? Is that what's going on, right? And you find yourself in this interesting emotional space, like, well, which group am I going to hang out with, right? Like, those are the cool kids, and you're really drawn to those kids because you're like, yeah, I want to be one of them. And actually, there's a decent amount of research on the sociology of childhood that's called the big man bias, right? And when you look at a lot of the research we've done in schools, it focuses on these popular groups, right? And so one of the reasons we have so many arguments about extreme gender difference in school is because we're focusing on these popular groups who do manifest more extreme gender differences than the vast majority of the population does, actually. So it's something to keep in mind if you're going to go into schools and do this kind of research. And so one of the things I tried to do was embed in these different classes. And so, and the administration, when they knew I wanted to research boys, they immediately thought, we need to get you in the classes with all the boys, right? So they sent me to auto shop. They sent me to the underperforming math classes, right? That was the word that the principal used. And they sent me to a weightlifting class, right? So these were the classes where the boys were, right? And eventually I sort of wormed my way into some other classes like drama and a history class. And I just sort of sat in the back of the class and just kind of hung out. And if students would talk to me, I would talk to them. And I was honest about what I was doing. I didn't try to lie, and I didn't try to fake it, right? Kids, when you're a faker, they know. And so don't be a faker, right? And I just sort of tried to play to my strengths, which were, I can be funny in a self-deprecating kind of way, right? I can make fun of myself a lot, so I did that a lot. I made fun of them when appropriate, right? Like if we were talking about sort of mountain biking or weightlifting or movies, right? I'd sort of make some kind of gentle joke, right? Because that was sort of a form of masculine currency. But there were moments that were really hard when one group of kids would see me with another group of kids and be like, why are you with that group of kids, right? And I'd have to sort of figure out how one navigates these sometimes not very strict groups that constitute high school, but sometimes very strict groups that constitute high school. And what I came to do was just sort of be open about it. Be like, wow, it is interesting that sort of with these different groups and y'all have different ideas and you're all in different places in the hierarchy here. And that's really interesting. And just to sort of call it out. And I would say the other thing I did was I didn't narc on them, right? That was one thing that students were really concerned about was who was I going to tell about the stuff they were telling me, right? And so one kid would be like, well, if I smoke pot, are you going to tell? No. If I ditch class, are you going to tell? No. If I kill someone, are you going to tell? I was like, yes. And so he was being really funny. And, kids would ask me, like, they'd go to class, be like, can you tell I'm tweaking? And I'm like, I don't know. I don't know what tweaking looks like. I don't even know what drugs that requires. But, it got really intense when I'd hear things about rape, right, from students. Either sort of their friends were victimized or they were rapists, right, which is essentially what Chad said to me. Or when Ricky would tell me these stories of victimization day after day after day, right? That's when it got really hard to not tell. Right? Was it my ethical responsibility to tell? And I still sort of grapple with that, right? Should I have told the administration about that? And I'm not sure, right? And that's something that ethnographers deal with on a fairly regular basis. Alice Goffman's recent study of violence in the inner city, she had to make some really difficult ethical choices about people's lives in that book. There's a book called Death Without Weeping where the ethnographer observed babies dying and at a certain point she knew what could save these babies' lives, right? But to do so would be to intervene in a really intense way in the community she was in. And should she have saved their lives? Right? It was really intense life and death choices that ethnographers make. And mine weren't at that level. But I think the choices I had to make in order to get there fast were sometimes, on the border ethically. Like, where was I ethically in order to sort of stay in that environment and to tell the stories that had to be told?
A whole train of thought about the agency of observation and what your thoughts are on that, but I don't want to go down that track right now. But I'm curious, because you referred to joking and humor multiple times, and it's just so thinking about how you saw yourself implicated, and how and heteronormativity is the entire framework of humor in high schools. So in order to get some currency, what you were trading.
Right.
So just talk a little bit.
Right, and so I did trade in heteronormativity, right? So one of the things I did do in this particular school is, I had a rainbow sticker because I was like 24 and all queer and happy about it, and I took my rainbow sticker off my car, which by default made me straight, right, in this particular community. But one of the things I experienced a lot was a lot of sexual harassment, right? The boys would do to me what they did to the girls, right? So-and-so wants to bang you, right? I can't remember what. There's other things there were other sort of sexualized jokes. And at one point, like a boy trapped me between his legs and I couldn't get through. It felt very, very violating. And so what I did several times was to draw on both heterosexual currency and the currency of age, right? Because I knew I couldn't engage in the fag discourse. Like, ethically, that for me was not going to actually happen, right? I wasn't going to sort of use homophobic joking. But what I would use was the power I had as a woman and as an older woman to sort of sexually humiliate a boy, right? Which is essentially the same thing, right? So towards the end of my field work, when I was like, I'm done, right? I have been sexually harassed for a year. I have watched homophobic harassment for a year. I've watched girls be sexually harassed for a year. I am done, and I do not need to maintain these ties anymore, right? This one boy who just like, the whole time, it was responsible for a lot of these, for a lot of sexual harassment I was at the receiving end of. I said something to him like, I was in high school once, and boys like you weren't impressive then, they're not impressive now, right? And like all the boys, and I said it in a funny way. I sound really mean when I said it right now, but I said it in a funny way because I think it's betrays how I really felt about him. And all the boys around laughed, and I just felt like mic drop, walk out, right? Like, so on the one hand, here I was engaging in the same form of sort of humiliation that boys use in order to establish some sort of sexual hierarchy, right? And here I was doing it because I think I felt so angry on behalf of so many girls, right? And some of the boys, and especially the gay boys, I was like, just like, I can't take anymore. Like, I'm abdicating my adult researcher responsibility at this moment. And I wrote about it and I sort of explored some of those things. It's mixed. It's really mixed. I use power in a particular way in that moment, right? And probably a lot of my anger that I remembered from being a girl in school myself, right? In those moments. Yeah.
I think it's interesting to think about how so much of our time in school, but really in all spaces, require all kinds of performances and require us to leverage the linguistic or other resources at our disposal to be able to navigate those spaces, right? So to become popular, to become safe, to become whatever, how do we have to perform? And what do we have to say? And what do we have to kind of leverage in order to navigate those spaces? I think you're talking about some examples that might stand out, but it does make me think about all the everyday occurrences that require us to perform in particular ways. And I think I would go further to say, it makes me think about whether you're interviewing someone, whether you're teaching, or whether you're just a member of a community, how much of our time in a conversation is not really about saying what I believe or what I feel, but it's about saying something in order to elicit a kind of response from everyone else around you. There's some great writings about doing an interview. Let me begin with this example. So there was someone, Michelle Foster is a scholar who wrote an article called "The Power to Know Isn't the Power to Know." Actually, I don't remember the name of the title of the article, but it's a great article. And what she's basically saying is, when she began interviewing these teachers, so she did a study on Black teachers, and what she said is that in the initial interviews, I had to assume that they weren't actually answering my questions with what they really felt. That what they were actually doing was answering my questions in a way that was trying to gauge how they responded to me. They were trying to gauge my trustworthiness. And don't we all kind of do this? Are you ever in a conversation with a friend and you don't know how they feel about CJ? So you're like, CJ's thing was kind of interesting. And then you watch to see how they respond. And if they were like, really? I love CJ. Then you're like, well, I better not go on with my complaint. But if they're like, yeah, see, this is kind of annoying. Then you're like, oh, well then let me play. So the initial way that I engaged in that conversation was a performative. It was not actually how I think. It was trying to gauge how you're going to respond, and that's going to shape the rest of my conversation. And what Michelle Foster was saying is, the whole beginning of her interview was that. She felt that they were trying to gauge, is she an insider? Could they trust her? And based on how she responded, they would then determine how much are they going to actually disclose versus how much are they going to say what they think she wants them to hear. Now, this happens in schools all the time too. How many of us are in our classrooms and we're saying what we really think versus what we think that particular professor wants to hear? Conversations are not always transparent. They're not always about what we really feel. They're so often about performance. And then let's just take this one layer further. When you're not even in a classroom and you're in social spaces, are we performing a lot? We absolutely are, right? I think that how I behave when I'm with my mother is not going to be the same way that I behave when I'm with my friend. And you can kind of guess that the way I'm talking right now, this is not how I talk to my sister. I mean, we engage differently. And yet they're all kind of true to who I am. And they're all kind of a performance given the context that we're in, right? This is the reality of kind of about wholeness and about authenticity. We should question all of these concepts, right? I don't actually remember why I'm going off on this, but I kind of think that your comments are so important because I think as we think about change, let's remember that what we're changing is not always individuals at their core, because what we see from individuals is so often performances driven by the context, right? In other words, what I'm trying to say, there's so much homophobia playing out in schools, but isn't that because, as you just said, so much of the context that we're in demands that we perform ourselves in homophobic ways, right? This is why changing people's attitudes is not the only thing we need to be doing. We need to be addressing the context as well.
Luckily, and I have 2 students in the class who are in this class. Luckily, for those of you who think this sort of argument about performance is interesting, there's a whole field of sociology, I can see you guys nodding, called symbolic interaction, which makes the case that everything we do is a performance, right? It's super fun, and I'd encourage you to show up in the class. It's pretty good. Those two can tell you about it. So if that sounded interesting, take a look at it.
Take a class.
Yeah, take a class. I'm just putting a little plug for myself.
So Kim, this is a question about the text, uncommon text. What was your process behind formulating or thinking about the 4 approaches that you developed? So educating for other.
So those of you who didn't read this book, I wrote one of the chapters in there is where I kind of take a whole bunch of the literature on multicultural education, and feminist pedagogy, and critical pedagogy, and post-colonial work, and queer theory, and all of this, and I tried to say, when I look across all these fields, what are the major themes that arise? And I came up with these 4 buckets that everything I thought kind of fell into. Yeah, it's such an interesting question. How did I come up with these? Because I actually changed my mind several times about how I wanted to group things. There are so many ways that we can come up with themes. But if you think about it, those of you who read the piece, there is one theme that carries through all 4, and it's the notion of the other, right? And so that's how I came up with this 4. I was at a time in my life where I was obsessed with the idea that it's not the case that some of us are just different. It's actually the case that society requires us to differentiate ourselves from others, right? And I wanted to kind of get us to think about how that plays out in terms of diversity and justice work. It makes me think about, it was really common back in the 90s to do diversity workshops, which we actually still do it this way, where our goal is to get you to understand how they are different than you. I'm sorry, that's not what I meant to say. What I meant to say is, we want to learn about differences by learning about as much as we can about the other group. But what's the underlying goal? Have you all heard when people say things like, well, underneath it all, don't we all cry? Underneath it all, don't we all love? Right? Underneath it, aren't we all the same? Is the goal of a lot of diversity trainings. Okay. Well, my obsession with the other was about questioning that as the goal. Because I don't think that we should always be saying everyone is the same. Because what that actually means is you're getting me to see how they are like me. I'm kind of projecting myself onto others, right? How about a different way of thinking about diversity training? How about a way of talking about diversity where their difference causes me to rethink myself? Getting myself to see how other groups are like me basically invites me to normalize everything that I think about myself. It affirms me, it instantiates me, right? And that's not necessarily a good thing if it doesn't force me to question my own positionality or my own partial kind of ways of operating in the world. So really, diversity training should be about using differences to trouble my own sense of self, to trouble my own sense of normalcy, right? So yes, it was my critique or my loving other people's critiques of this way of thinking about diversity training that caused me to obsess about the process of othering, which then became the central part of these 4 approaches.
CJ? It says, when answering the question about tomboys and effeminate males, you explain that tomboys have been able to carve the space out for themselves under certain conditions. You said you talk a lot about masculinity. What does your work have to say about femininity? Do you believe your work shows evidence of opposition to femininity?
Opposition to femininity by, okay, I'm just gonna, all right, so I'm just gonna riff on that because I don't know by whom. I don't know if somebody wants to type.
Maybe the pressures on femininity.
Okay, great.
That makes sense?
Yes, sure. I'm just gonna answer it as I imagine.
Talk about the pressures around masculinity. So.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about masculinity and femininity. So we don't have a lot of theorizing around femininity, which is kind of interesting, right? We have a whole body of work about gender, and we have a whole body of work about masculinity, which I find to be very interesting, right? Men have masculinity, women have gender. And I think there's a reason for this. It's not totally diabolical, but it's a little bit. I play into this as well. I write about men having masculinity and women having gender. But one of the things that happened, right, when we start talking about sort of gender inequality, right, we're talking about women, right? We were concerned with the second wave feminist movement. We were going to examine women. Nobody looks at women. They're not in the history books. They're not anywhere, right? So let's start talking about them. And then somewhere in the 80s, out of the men's movement, out of the gay rights movement, we were like, men are shaped by gender too. We got to start talking about this, right? So we did, right? One of the ways that started to get talked about was through like men's rights activism, which is probably not the world's like best approach. But the other approach was this sort of what we call the new sociology of masculinity. And that's sort of where the split started. We started talking about gender, and we started talking about masculinity, right? It wasn't that everybody had gender, it was that men had masculinity and women had gender. And part of the reason that is, it's not just because men wanted to hold on to masculinity because it's something awesome, it's that everybody wanted to distance themselves from femininity, right? Even now, when we write about women, we don't write about femininities. The main explanatory model in sociology for masculinity is the multiple masculinities model, right? Men get to have all sorts of masculinity, right? Finally, Jack Halberstam was like, women have masculinity too, right? And like wrote this whole book called Female Masculinity, but he's really the only one to do that. But we don't have multiple femininities, right? There may be like 2 or 3 sort of times that it's really sort of talked about femininities in the literature, like women have gender, right? And so one of the things that I think that's happening, again, is the sort of legacy of the second wave feminist movement, is that we all distance ourselves from femininity. Both men and women do it, which is one of the reasons that there's several sort of things that sort of emerge out of this, right? Tomboys have a space because, of course, nobody wants to be feminine. Who wouldn't want to be a tomboy? That's rad, right? I mean, like, duh, right? Whereas we don't, why would you want to wear a dress? Why would you want to be a girl, right? It's this whole, like, stop the pink movement, right? Like, why are we pinkifying everything? And I'm like, why aren't we pinkifying everything, right? I mean, there's nothing wrong with things being pink, right? But the way we've sort of understood feminism has has been to denigrate femininity, to say like, we don't want things to be pink. You should be out there playing soccer. You should be being tough like the boys, right? I mean, be a little bit girly, but we sort of try to get rid of all these things that are feminine. And what the boys are doing when they're engaging in this sort of fag discourse is they're really putting down femininity, right? I mean, yes, it's about homosexuality, but mostly it's about being unmasculine, and being unmasculine in their mind is to be feminine. To be feminine means you're nothing, right? And so I think one of the ways to sort of fight back against this, and what I think feminism needs to do, and I think some of the sort of slut walks are doing this, but it's this wholesale embracing of femininity. Like, let's do this, right? And when I go around, I mean, I give talks on Dude all the time, and often I'll get these guys to come up from the audience and they'll be like, I'm a radical faggot. And they're just like, all in glitter and maybe some dresses, but don't totally identify as genderqueer necessarily. But this notion of this reclaiming of femininity, right, as sort of this everyday activism, I think is really, really powerful, right? To the extent to which we can stop sort of saying like, oh, feminine is bad. Both men and women need to do it. And I think I'll sort of tag my little mother observations onto the end of this, which is, oh my gosh, once you become the mother of a child that has a vulva, the amount of times you'll get into conversations with people who are like, by people I mean mothers, like, oh, I don't want my girl to wear anything pink. I hate pink. I can't believe she wears dresses. I never wore dresses, right? Because there's this discursive work that women start to do to distance themselves from femininity, right? And blame that femininity on their daughters, right? And say, I don't want my daughter to do that, but she wants it to. Right? And so it's this really sort of complex work that's happening to sort of grab onto some of this discursive power that belongs to masculinity that's being done on behalf of mothers these days. Am I totally professional and N of one, right? Sort of observations. But I think one of these sort of forms of everyday activism we can start to engage in is sort of to call out those moments, even when we find ourselves doing it, right? This sort of repudiating of femininity and pinkness. Right?
So I think this is, again, kind of aimed at both of you, is sort of this question is, how did it come to be that your work in the various ways that it did addresses LGBTQ issues? So sort of what meaning that has for you, how it's come up in your work, how it started, just how it's influenced or why it exists in your work.
Nothing, I just talked for a while.
When I was in graduate school, I feel like we were all so self-absorbed. So many grad students, what do we study? We study stuff that's affected our lives. It's like our own way of working through our own traumas. I feel like it's so often what we do. There's some interesting theories that say, I'll come back to my little story about grad school, but I do think that there's something to be said around how a lot of our life choices are about working through things that happened to us earlier, right? Why do we choose the careers that we choose? Why do we engage in the kinds of relationships that we... there's so many great theories about how you choose the people you date or the people you end up with, in whatever that means. And I think that so much of it is because we're trying to work through in our future life what happened to us in our past. So I think that I highly encourage, by the way, being what I at the time thought was super self-absorbed, but I actually don't think that that's a bad thing. I actually think that there's something to be said about bringing voices or bringing perspectives from some real experiences to speak to some of these problems, right? Because so many times it is outsiders who are studying, or it's insiders who are maybe studying but without enough complexity to challenge their own frameworks. In other words, sometimes it's the non-queer people studying the queer people saying, let's try to make sense of what's wrong with this group. Or it's the queer people saying, I need to write about myself because I need to validate everything that I think, right? And neither of them is actually really helpful. What's actually really helpful is to see how different lenses can cause us to kind of ask different kinds of questions about the experiences that we're trying to study, right? And that's our challenge. Whether you're whether you're on the inside or outside, and those labels are always contested, but whether you're on the inside or the outside, so long as you're not forcing yourself to use different lenses to make sense of the problems and the solutions, you're actually not necessarily pushing the envelope, right? Education and research and activism isn't about affirmation. It's actually about bringing difference into the conversation. And so I urge us to do that. Okay, so that was my kind of digression to say. So I think for me, there were certain moments where questions came up for me that rattled how I was making sense of the world. And those moments I credit with kind of pushing me in a direction that I found useful, but that also helped me kind of make my mark in my profession or in the field, right? So for example, I'm experiencing feeling like, where do I go? Because maybe if I'm with my Asian American friends, I don't really feel like I always fit, maybe because of gender sexuality issues. Or if I'm with my queer friends, maybe I don't really fit because of race issues or cultural issues, or gender issues for that matter, and so on, right? And so then I come across frameworks not only that are trying to make sense of this marginality, but that are also raising questions about how commonly we are talking about those things. I think those are kind of the moments that I have found to be really powerful. And I guess this is also a way for me of saying, you know, we want to follow our hearts and our passions as we think about the areas we want to research in or the areas we want to do advocacy in. But we want to do so in a way that invites those uncomfortable spaces. In other words, we want to look for places where we feel a little troubled and a little destabilized, because I think those are the places that will push us to do the work in some really profound ways.
So, this question always interests me. I often get phone calls, you know, from reporters or people wanting me to talk about LGBTQ youth. And I'm like, I don't know much about LGBTQ youth, queer youth, right? I don't. Like, ARA came knocking one day and was like, hey, we're writing this big report on the future of research on LGBTQ youth, and we want you to be a part of writing that. And I'm like, yeah, so I know about heterosexual masculinity, right? So that's what's really interesting, is that's what I study, and that's what I set out to study, right? And people have a very hard time tolerating that, right? So when I set out to research Dude, my research question was like, how do boys understand masculinity? That was my research question. I knew very little about sexuality. Sexuality was a taboo subject in sociology at that point, unless we were going to study like the number of homosexuals and what they do in the bedroom. That was okay, but to actually say the social construction of heterosexual or any kind of sexuality was like, oh no, that's sexuality is not socially constructed. It is what we are. And so I went in. I didn't go into the school to study queer kids, right? And even if you look at the book, there's Ricky, and then there's like Rebecca, and like a couple of the Gay Straight Alliance girls, but they're really the minority in the book. The queer kids, right? It's about straight boys and some straight girls, right? And my research now is still about straight boys and how they do their straight white boyness, right? But what's so funny is people, and I'm not saying the person who wrote this question is asking this at all, but people have a hard time tolerating that and want me to continually talk about queer kids. And I'm like, okay, so yeah, I'll talk about them, but what we really need to talk about is the construction of straight white masculinity, sort of, and the way in which that particular construction sort of tortures queer kids, right? Like, that's what we need to do, and girls, right, and other boys. So really, what we need to talk about is the costs of heterosexual masculinity for everyone, including heterosexual boys, right? And people always want to sort of go back to this sort of stigmatized group rather than talking about the dominant group, because it's just much harder to tolerate that discussion, I think.
So just to turn on the mic, just to editorialize for a second. I think the fact that there are 4 queer scholars sitting here in bodies is fairly significant to people in this case, and certainly significant to me. So I think it also, in some ways, recognizing that whatever we're studying is fairly significant in education, We can drive a conversation in some new and interesting ways, and sameness cannot do that, right? Sameness does not produce new and different sorts of observations. It just confirms itself. That was my moment. CJ. After observing, documenting interactions of harassment, I'm afraid we already discussed it. What role did you take in reporting of any harassment? So you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I carry that weight with me on a daily basis, right? Because I didn't. I'm still in touch with Ricky. I'm still in touch with Rebecca. I'm still in touch with a few of the Gay Straight Alliance girls. So I have these very personal relationships with these guys still. But I didn't report it. I gave the administration an article I wrote based on the book. Nothing. I gave one of the teachers an article I wrote based on the book because I thought that might be easier than like the book. Nothing. And so one of the things that I always make sure to do, and I know this is a very strange thing, is no matter what, when public school teachers or students or school districts ask me for something, I give it back, right? The other day I was coming home from some talk I was giving, and this student, I don't even know what school she was from, she was calling and had questions about something that was only like tangentially related to anything I do, but like any sociologist probably talk about it, was something about inequality. And I was like, I will schedule time out of my day, definitely, absolutely, to talk to you, right? Like that there's some way in which I feel like I have to pay back all of these kids who gave something to all of us, right? And so that's one of the ways I try to sort of use everything I've learned, even though couldn't stop it there, or I didn't stop it there, and I don't know which one of those words I want to use. I didn't stop it when it was happening. I take my responsibility to stop it now, right, in my position, very, very, very seriously. And so that's sort of where I kind of ended up in terms of my ethical and moral responsibility.
Well, I think part of that question that often comes up in sharing your work and in sharing most ethnographies is people are very curious about the continuing lives of your subjects.
Yeah.
Right. So what you can share about their.
Sure.
So that's.
You want me to share?
Sure.
Yeah. Great.
Because I think that's where.
Yeah. So Ricky is doing fairly well. He is an incredibly successful drag queen. Incredibly successful. He's amazing. My eldest son loves him a good princess outfit and story. And Ricky has a lot of Disney characters that he does, and so I've often shown them to my son, and he's incredible, and so he's doing very well. Rebecca is also doing well. She's in a long-term relationship with the love of her life, and it has a great job, and she's living a very happy, normal life in Northern California. Right? I mean, that's kind of the extent of what I can say about her. So Rebecca was the one who sort of went back and forth between being masculine and feminine, and then Jackie. Whoops. Right. Okay.
Wrong name. Flip their names, right?
Yep. Okay. Great. She is also doing very, very well. Long-term relationship, wonderful job, great life. And then Devin, I think I call her in the book. We actually, and she's one of the Gay Straight Alliance girls, we actually have the same amount of kids. We had them roughly around the same time. And so we're in touch on a fairly regular basis, just about every other day, where we participate in a mother's group together. Unbeknownst to each other, we met up in this mother's group. And she's like, wait, are you? I was like, are you? And so we parent kids from afar together. And so it's really cool. It's really interesting. Yeah.
So we're going to stop at 4:30, by the way. And just breathe.
It's tiny writing, Kevin. Breathe. How do you stay connected to conversations of practice in schools in an administrative role? And then it says, how do you carry contemporary concerns in the field to spaces that you have access to now?
Yeah. So I might actually bring those two questions together because I think one of my hopes is for our profession to really experiment with what it means to act more collectively to bring about change. You know, we are a very individualized and kind of assimilationist profession. And I'm actually, I guess I'm talking about multiple professions, but let me talk about classroom teachers. For many people, being a good classroom teacher is that I'm able to close the door and just be brilliant in the classroom. And we forget that the role of the teacher should also be to engage in the larger project of public education. And same with researchers. Like in universities, how do you often get tenure and promoted? Well, it's that you're writing in journals that are read by other researchers, which maybe a few dozen, get to read your piece. And we actually discourage researchers from doing things like writing for the newspaper or testifying to the school board, or actually, in other words, leveraging your research to impact the broader public conversation and public policy. So a lot of my preoccupation over the past few years has been to try to figure out what would it mean for the profession of educators or the profession of educational researchers to be more collective, to leverage what we have, the resources that we have, to try to impact the public debate or public policy. So some of my projects, for example, is to really learn from, let me talk about a few populations. Parents in Chicago was able to stop the mayor from his reform initiative. So we have Rahm Emanuel, who just got elected, re-elected mayor in Chicago. And when he first got elected mayor, this is what he said. He said, you know what, Chicago has one of the shortest school days in this nation. So we need to change that. We need to lengthen the school day. So I want it to be 2 hours longer. And that was his campaign. And everyone was like, what? Chicago has one of the shortest school days? All right, yes, let's lengthen it, because that's going to make it better. Well, there was actually, he wasn't saying what we're going to do during that time. I mean, it's presumably the same thing, like preparing for tests, right? How is that going to make anything better? So what the parents did, which we've never seen before in Chicago, is about 20 parent groups came together and issued this research report through a press conference that basically said, here's what we believe is in the best interest of our schools. We're going to look at the research. We're going to make a case that this is not what should happen. And within 24 hours, the mayor publicly responded to the parents by saying, all right, I will not lengthen the day by 2 hours. I would do it by 90 minutes. But my point is that they at least got the mayor to respond, which is pretty amazing, that he would turn around that quickly and change his policy directive. What about teachers? I would say the same thing. Do we often think about what it means to collectivize as classroom teachers to try to impact change? Same with educational researchers. What does it mean for professors to speak collectively? This is, I think, one of the ways that I'm trying to carve new spaces to do the kind of activist work that I'm really interested in. And I think why I think it's unique for me now is I think as a dean, people pay attention a little bit more than if I were a professor. And so I'm trying to take advantage as much as I can of being in that particular position. Let me just, to the first question around practice, I think, so to connect with what I was just saying, one thing that I'm really interested in is seeing the profession of public school teachers see their work as more than classroom teaching. That I actually think the work of the classroom teacher or the public school teacher needs to be about engaging in the public sector, right? Teachers need to be a part of the conversations around school reform. Their voices need to be centrally a part of it, and the way that they're going to get there is not by speaking individually, but by speaking collectively into that debate. And so I'm really committed to trying to see, well, what role can I play in trying to reframe what it means to be a classroom teacher, right? I think that more universities are actually preparing their teachers to see themselves as part of the public, right? So more universities are preparing teachers to understand what's going on with policy, not only what's going on with curriculum and pedagogy. And I would urge all of you in this room to continue that work, right? To be engaged, to be informed, and to figure out ways to, as a teacher, intervene in reform initiatives.
before someone asks questions. So if you wanted to share any sort of last thoughts, anything swirling around in the conversation. And then Corey, when we finish, is going to share a quick announcement. And then if you don't mind staying around for a few minutes, she just visit with people. So,
yeah, I mean, I'll conclude with a final thought that I often end my public lectures with, which is that, you know, we often think about movements towards social justice as happening on a large scale, right? Like we've got to mount a campaign and be in a protest and all of these things. But one of the things that I encourage people to do is the same thing that I encourage teachers to do in that first question that somebody asked, which is that you can intervene in the interactions that you have on a daily basis. And so you can be that charming yet slightly annoying person, right? Who's like, what you just said is really funny. What did you mean by that? Right? And, you know, play dumb or, you know, be a know-it-all, whatever your strength is, but to intervene in that conversation sort of in a way that keeps your ties with that person, right? I care about you. We're going to keep this relationship going. But this is a really interesting thing that you just said. Let's talk about it, right? And to figure out how to do that in your different relationships, because that can go a really long way, right? This sort of everyday activism in the relationships that you have with other people, right? Because often when we end our sociology classes, sorry guys, we've taken them, people are like, oh my gosh, so much is wrong with the world, we're never going to fix it, right? There are some things we can fix, and we can fix them in our everyday interactions by just highlighting social justice when it happens at this micro-interactional level. We can all do that.
That's great. I love that. I think my final thought would be so often when we try to figure out how to intervene, we are trying to find an intervention that's doable. What's something that I think I can succeed in? And I think as important as it is to find the interventions that we can succeed in, it's also important to think about how do I engage in work where the success is not so easy. I like to tell, I was once giving a talk to a large room of high school students, all in a diversity clubs. And I could talk about race and they were with me. And I could talk about religion and they seemed with me. When I talked about homophobia, there was a lot of looking around at each other like, oh, this is making me uncomfortable. And I said in that room, you know what? Being an activist doesn't mean that everything I'm going to do is going to feel comfortable. Like, in fact, if my work is about changing, is about social change, if my work is about disrupting the status quo, and if my work is about challenging my own privileges, then that means my work is going to make not just the people around me uncomfortable, but me uncomfortable as well. And I think if we're open to that, if we're open to that as a mindset, it opens up the possibilities for what activism can be. And so I urge us to really think really broadly about how my engaging in activism is never going to be like a sentence that's already concluded. It's never going to be something that I've already foretold in terms of what the strategy is and what the outcome is going to be. But activism, one of my favorite advisors used to say, activism is always something in the making. It's always being made as I engage in it. Just like identity is always in the making. I'm always becoming the process of becoming who I am. It's not like I know who I'm going to be, and I'm going to be all happy once I get to that place. Identity is something that's always evolving, and it's in the process of being, of becoming. It's in the process of that evolution that I am who I am, right? It's not about being in an end place. And so, in the activism in the making, the role of discomfort in activism, let's embrace those uncertainties and see what kinds of radical transformations that can happen when those are the paths we follow.